Good morning, everyone. My name is Doug Howgate, Executive Vice President at Mass Taxpayers Foundation, and we're trying something new today. We're going to do a video recording of our presentation on the Senate Ways and Means ARPA bill and things to expect for the upcoming Senate debate. So with that, I'm going to start sharing my screen. And so here we go. Again, this is something a little new. What we're going to try to do is organize it even more closely than we normally do by topic areas. And in the email that you have received with this, it should have timestamps so that you don't have to sit through, although I'm sure you want to, sit through an hour of me talking and can instead jump to whatever specific section is of most interest to you. The sections we're going to review today, going to go through the fiscal background of both the surplus and ARPA. We're going to talk about some of MTF's recommendations, both at a high level and some pretty specific recommendations that we think we see reflected in large part in the House and Senate approaches. And then we're going to delve into the Senate proposal, some key themes, general spending areas. Then we're going to look at healthcare, UI and premium pay, workforce and education, taxes, and then kind of some general amendment themes and next steps. So with that, we'll get started. And again, I'm going to start with a conversation on just the fiscal background. So really two components that's important to understand as we look at the House Senate bills on the surplus and ARPA. First and foremost is the FY21 budget surplus. And I think the confusing element of this for a number of people has been this discussion of a $5 billion budget surplus. That $5 billion number actually refers to our tax revenue surplus in FY21, which is absolutely unprecedented. The reality is, though, a number of things kind of have to come off the top of that $5 billion before you can calculate the budget surplus. So some money goes directly to our stabilization funds, some money goes directly to the MBTA and SBA, and then we have to take a lot of those resources and kind of plug some budget gaps that if we didn't have all this tax revenue from, we were going to have to use to balance the budget, additional state draws, relying on some federal funds that we were going to get later in the year, things like that. So once you do all of those things, you're left with a preliminary preliminary budget surplus of a little over $2 billion. Now, the governor's proposal back in the summer was to essentially spend down that surplus, notably with $1 billion deposited into our state's UI trust fund. The legislature took a different approach where really they focused on deficiencies, kind of closing the books, had to make about $500 million in expenditures, and then they retained a surplus of about $1.5 billion that they put in a separate fund. And that $1.5 billion is a key part of the legislation, the spending legislation we're seeing the Senate debate this week. So the other key element for us to understand as we go through this are states' fiscal recovery funds. So fiscal recovery funds were one of the key elements of the American Rescue Plan, flexible funds for states, counties, cities, and towns. Massachusetts received $5.3 billion. About $400 million of that's already accounted for, and about $4.9 billion needs to be appropriated. The bills that are going through the process right now are the first attempt to spend a part of that $4.9 billion. And just to refresh your memory, the governor had already put out his plan to spend that a component of that $4.9 billion earlier in the summer. And what I draw your attention to here is there really are some similarities between this process and the budget process. I think you hear from a number of folks, oh, the governor's proposal, no one cares about that. It doesn't really matter. It's really what the House and Senate do. And certainly the House and Senate are doing different things that the governor didn't propose and are going in their own directions. But it's pretty apparent that the roadmap he set forth in terms of housing, ECDEV, workforce, healthcare, and infrastructure, those are really the priority areas you see reflected in the House and now the Senate's plans. And so while they may change in what the numbers are, how they prioritize within those areas, it's notable to me that the things you see the House and Senate not doing, say early education, stuff like that, are the things the governor didn't propose, right? So I think his proposal has had a lot of value in terms of establishing what those priorities were that we now see as part of the legislation. So now we're just going to talk a little bit about MTF's publications that have provided some both high level and pretty specific recommendations. So we've published two pieces over the summer and fall laying out some priorities and recommendations for lawmakers. The first of those was these kind of general fiscal principles. And generally speaking, I think you see a lot of this reflected in the bills that are being debated, although there are a couple areas with some definite room for kind of further improvement, I guess I would say. So first and foremost is sustainability, and generally I think we're seeing that in terms of one-time uses. A couple of things that's probably a little wait and see to see exactly how one-time some of these expenditures are, but generally speaking, I think you are seeing a focus on that. We're absolutely seeing the importance of prioritization, right? I think the one thing you can say for all three proposals is they pretty clearly focus on a few areas and try to do a lot for them, as opposed to spending money over countless possible policy priority areas. One area where I think there's definitely room to do better is evidence and valuation. The House and Senate both provide some resources to whether it's the IG or the auditor, the AG, some combination thereof, to do some kind of public-facing oversight websites. What we really haven't seen thus far is an attempt to create an architecture to understand how impactful these expenditures are. Are they doing what we want them to do? I think that's an area we're going to continue to hit hard. Coordination with other with other ARPA resources, we see this almost in a negative way. And what I mean by that is, I think the absence of some spending elements in the House and Senate proposals is due to either the reality of other federal resources through ARPA or the assumption that other federal resources will be able to be brought to bear. Again, I'll bring it back to early childhood education for a second. I don't know this, but it appears that one of the reasons that you haven't seen that in some of these legislative proposals is, well, EEC has some other resources they can use. The feds may have some more money to spend in the Build Back Better bill. And so that's coordination in a way. I think there are other ways to maybe more proactively coordinate too, but that's one thing that how we're seeing coordination play out there. And then this idea of kind of impact now versus long-term impact, I think you see that more in terms of the level of resources the legislature is spending, where they're trying to, it appears, keep the level of FRF use to under 2.5 billion or so, which would leave about 2.3 billion going forward. To me, that speaks to this idea of trying to get some stuff that's impacting everyone now, while also retaining significant resources for the future. In terms of some specific policy recommendations, we laid out, say, 10 to 15 different programs across 4 kind of broad priority areas. And by and large, I think you've seen these gain traction in the House and Senate. Certainly, we're not the only people to propose a lot of these things, but in some areas, I think hopefully our analysis was helpful. The importance of a stronger and more regionalized local public health system. You certainly see that in the House and Senate approaches. UI, obviously, I think the level of expenditure in the House and Senate bills at 500 million, less than what the governor proposed, less than I think what we would argue would make a real return on investment there. In terms of some of the things we term as these barriers to prosperity, absolutely a continued focus on housing production, food security. Happy to see some continuation of grants there in the House and Senate plans. Mental health workforce, a critical need in Massachusetts that we're seeing a lot of investment in the House and Senate proposals. Early college for us is again a missed opportunity at this stage of the game. Evidence-based program clearly impacts a lot of those disproportionately affected communities. Haven't seen that yet in either of the proposals. Workforce, I think, while English for Advancement, which is the program we highlighted, isn't mentioned specifically, JVS, which is the entity that runs it, is provided with some resources in the House proposal. And certainly there's a lot of resources that could be used in both the House and Senate versions. And then infrastructure, water, sewer, and K-12 through either VOC or HVAC is an element of in some or all of the House and Senate proposals, and that was something we highlighted as well. So now we're going to do kind of a broad overview of the Senate legislation and some key kind of spending and policy themes. So what's new in the Senate Ways and Means bill? One, and I'll get to this in a second, they have a different kind of fiscal approach, how you assign what, whether it's federal or state resources to a different spending program. They do it differently than either the governor or the House did, which I think is worth paying a little bit of attention to. Another thing is by and large, when you're looking at programs that may be included in both the House and the Senate's version, the Senate version tends to be much more detailed in kind of its delineation of how the funds are going to be expended, what the reporting requirements are, those types of things. And we can again talk about that again in a second. On workforce, they have a little bit more of a sector-specific approach, specifically in areas like human services, cybersecurity, and then again, a clear focus on mental health, which has obviously been a Senate priority since Senate President Spilka took over. You absolutely see that in this legislation. And then what's the same? The general scope of spending is essentially identical to the House Ways and Means proposal. Again, we'd expect to see the Senate add some money on the floor. The general priority areas, getting back to what I said earlier about the governor's bill, really haven't changed that much. A couple unique things, but generally speaking, it's those same 5 priority areas. Clear focus on disproportionate impact, which is a good thing. And then again, I think something we'd love to see more attention paid to going forward. You really don't see this attempt to try to figure out, are these programs working? Not just how's the money being, not just, you know, a website of where the money's spent or who spends it, but are we trying to think through how we can figure out if it's actually having an impact? You don't see a lot of that in either the House or Senate proposals. So just getting into line item language for a second, and this is really just illustrative. Picked here the public health line item that both, it wasn't in the governor's bill, House did it, Senate did it. And what you see here is the House proposal is pretty broad, right? It's for support for regional and local public health investments, right? There's a small earmark for an HBC analysis. And aside from that, it's some general stuff. Senate is a much more kind of prescriptive approach. We'll get into the details of it, but I think even just the number of words hopefully gives you a sense of the different kind of line item approach. And you see this generally in most of the line items where there's overlap between the House and Senate. Now, depending on what you're interested in, this is a good or a bad thing, right? If you want some level of discretion and you trust an administering agency to run a program the way you want it, you'd probably prefer the House version. If you're really concerned about how specific funds are going to be plugged in to specific programmatic uses and you want some reporting language and those types of things, the Senate language tends to do more of that. But it's a consistent kind of difference between the two bills. And I would just say on that, it's important if you are interested in an area, even if you see those numbers in both the House and Senate, you got to really see what the Senate did in language because there are some important language differences. So in terms of the approach to resources, mentioned this quickly before. So what, as we discussed, we got federal funds and we got a state surplus. And essentially what the House and the administration did is for each item, it was easy in the governor's proposals because he did it in two separate bills. But in the House bill, for example, each item you can figure out exactly whether it's being funded through federal, the fiscal recovery funds or the state surplus. There's a fund, what's called a fund split under items funded through the feds, by the feds, which says 100% of this is going to come from those fiscal recovery funds. Everything else comes from the general fund. And so each of those can be assigned. And so what you can see when the House has done their debate is how much did they spend in FRF funds? How much did they spend in surplus? What's left? Senate took a different approach. What the Senate said was, listen, we don't want to spend any more than 2.5 billion in FRF. We don't want to spend any more than 1.45 in the surplus. A&F, you figure out how to assign these spending areas to different sources over the coming months to not exceed those caps. So why did they do that? They did it, I think, because of some compliance and oversight requirements related to the American Rescue Plan. So certain expenditures are better suited for the FRF than they are for the state surplus and vice versa. And what I think the Senate recognizes is we don't always know right now which program may potentially have some compliance issues with the federal money and could be better served through the surplus, and which ones we may really want to use that federal money for. And so some level of flexibility makes sense. I think that's absolutely true and probably a smart thing to think about. I think the challenge is going to be, you look at a lot of these programs that are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, those expenditures are going to occur over a pretty long time horizon. And so the challenge is we may not know how much, if the Senate approach were to prevail, we may not know exactly how much we have left in ARPA funds for months, right? And so as the House and Senate and the administration are figuring out, round 2 of ARPA legislation or other bills that may rely on FRF funds, that lack of clarity could be challenging, right? And so there really is some benefits. Understanding some level of discretion makes sense as well. There is some benefit, though, in trying to have some clarity about, okay, how much in ARPA did we use? Presumably, we're going to spend down the surplus. What's left? And so this will be an interesting thing to watch going forward. In terms of kind of general spending priorities, here you can see these are priority areas as identified by MTF, kind of the tail of the tape of where the governor, House, and Senate Ways and Means all line up. I'm going to go into this in more detail later on, and we'll obviously send slides along as well. Hopefully they're attached to the email that this link is on. But what you can see here is a couple areas of clear kind of increase for the Senate, notably healthcare, right? Premium pay, a big difference between the House, Senate administration. And again, we'll get into some of the areas where they don't spend quite as much. So key themes, some of these we've already touched on. Areas of focus: mental health, sector-specific workforce, hospital payments, not as much as the House, but still definitely much more than the governor, and a couple new pilot programs that you didn't see in either previous proposal. Where are they doing less? Well, compared to the governor, it's really about UI, right? $500 million less there. Infrastructure, housing, Economic development compared to the House. House did a lot more on earmarking some specific K-12 programs or education-related programs. House did more on food security, although the Senate includes that as well, and same with nursing facilities. So housing and infrastructure. So this is a chart we included a version of with the House proposal as well, where you can really see, hey, both the House and the Senate are spending $1 billion plus on housing and infrastructure, much less than the governor. I think that the area of concern for that I would just flag is, hey, there's any number of ways you could spend this money on really important programs. The nice thing about water infrastructure, sewer infrastructure, housing is we know we have a huge need for improvement, right? And so, and there are existing programs that can spend the money now. And so this is why it was an area that we highlighted to, and I think you saw in the governor's bill, to really get some money out the door on some of these critical areas. Now, I think the House and Senate might say, hey, we got an infrastructure bill that just passed. We're already doing a lot. There's going to be other resources there. I get that, but I would say that the scope of the need in Massachusetts is such that I don't think we have to worry that the infrastructure bill is going to solve it, right? That there really is a huge need here. And there's also a big overlap with disproportionately impacted communities. So I think there really is a stronger case to be made that maybe some increased investments in these areas make sense. Okay, so going to get into some specific policy areas, and we're going to start with healthcare because there's a lot going on here. So really, you can see healthcare spending in 4 areas in both the House and the Senate Ways and Means proposal. Nursing facilities and public health, 2 programs not included in any of the governor's previous proposals. You see both those in both the House and the Senate Ways and Means proposals. Mental health and providers, the governor, provider payments, governor did propose, but the House and Senate increased those numbers significantly in both cases. So that's really the 4 areas. And you see 225 in the governor, 740 in the House, 900 million in the Senate and Senate Ways and Means. So really a big scope difference there. So we'll start with nursing and public health. Nursing homes, House at 70, Senate Ways and Means at 50. So aside from just those numbers being different, the other key difference that House divides the money, $30 million for capital improvements, 40 for workforce. Senate really does 2 different workforce programs for the 50 million. Even though the top line of the item mentions capital improvements, my read of it is essentially earmarks out the entire 50 for 2 workforce programs. So a little bit of a different focus there. Public health, big priorities in both bills, right? 150 in the House, 250 in the Senate. This is essentially what the Mass Public Health Association and those groups were asking for. As I mentioned before, pretty general program design in the House. Senate has 3 specific program earmarks. So we got about $115 million for a standardized a data system that would be created and then implemented statewide, 5 years of technical assistance grants. This is one of those areas where I think there's a lot of need here. One concern we'll have going forward is kind of what's the transition plan for how this technical assistance hopefully regionalizes, improves, but doesn't require an ongoing expenditure that we don't have budgeted for right now. And then also some significant funding to help public health staff meet professional credentials, things like that they may not in all of our cities and towns right now. So that's nursing homes and public health. Mental health. So again, big priority in both bills. Not a lot of overlap between both bills. House has $100 million in kind of general mental health workforce, which could fit into some things in the Senate bill, but strictly speaking, you really don't see much overlap between the 2 bills going forward. And just to tease something I'll talk about later on, one thing we need to figure out is what's the bottom line total spend of these 2 proposals when you put them together. Big question is, when you combine these bills, are we talking about $650 million in mental health proposals, right? 400 plus 250 or something less? And I think that's something we'll have to figure out. In terms of the Senate approach, the biggest component of it is another new healthcare trust fund. I think the one we created a few months ago was getting lonely, so they created another one. Behavioral health trust fund, really focused here on providing mental health services and expanding mental health services in a culturally competent way to low-income communities, communities of color, right? Elements of our society that really have not had access to high-quality mental health services, either geographically or for whatever reason. And so that's a clear focus. The fund, I believe, is subject to appropriation, but advised by an advisory panel made up of a lot of different stakeholders. Other key theme in the House approach is workforce. They've got a really interesting and I think kind of cool loan repayment program. We talked about this a little bit in what we wrote about that's intended to get folks who are mental health professionals who go to work in community health centers or places that serve low-income patients to do that by getting their loans paid off, right? And so I think that's a really interesting one to see. And then a couple other smaller programs as well. So provider payments, we're going to spend a few slides on this just because there's a lot of differences. So first, kind of just this slide just compares the three proposals, right? Governor did 50 for a pretty specific subset of hospitals. House broke their 270 into three components. We got 20 for community health centers, 50 for high public pay hospitals, 200 in a pretty broad grant program for everyone else. Senate just has 200, and that's in a kind of more targeted acute hospital grant program, okay? So let's figure out what the Senate is doing. So under the Senate proposal, grants are available to acute hospitals impacted by COVID-19. That's kind of the topic sentence for the line item. They charge, like the Senate, like the House, they charge EOHHS with coming up with a distribution methodology, but they include some more kind of guidelines around how that distribution methodology will at least prioritize funds. So EOHHS, in coming up with it, there are a couple things they have to do, right? And nothing super shocking here, right? They have to look at increased expenses, lost revenues due to the pandemic, federal and state funds you already received, right? There was a very generous federal provider relief program that provided billions of dollars to providers around the state. So we got to kind of account for that as we're coming up with our method. And then the underlying financial health of the hospital. Other interesting thing about the Senate proposal is they essentially tell EOHHS, you got to tell us your distribution methodology and actually how it's going to be distributed 45 days before you do it. Now, in terms of those prioritization areas, I want to be clear, at least under my reading of it, any acute hospital is eligible to receive a grant, but certain hospitals within that group are prioritized. Okay, who's prioritized? Well, one, prioritization is limited to nonprofit hospitals. And the way it's written, you have to meet two or more to be prioritized again, not to be eligible, to be prioritized. You meet two or more of these four criteria, right? So you just serve a disproportionately impacted community. You have a total margin loss, which I think is attempting to kind of have that pretty, I guess, contextualized view of hospital finances due to the pandemic in 1 of 3 years. You're designated by CHIA as an independent community or independent teaching hospital, or a public payer mix of 65% or higher. So if you meet two of those and you're nonprofit, you're going to be prioritized. I wouldn't be surprised to see some tweaking with this language on the floor. There's a Feingold amendment that expands hospitals to hospital systems and also eliminates the nonprofit criteria for prioritization. But that's what the Senate Ways and Means bill proposes. So let's just compare it to the House for a second. And in the appendix that I'll send around, I'll include a deeper dive into what the House did. So an interesting structure issue to keep in mind. So both bills include a line item that appropriates the money for these provider relief payments. The House, all the policy in the House proposal resides in an outside section that creates a trust fund, EOHHS distributes it, and that's kind of where all the criteria are. Senate does it all in the line item. And so that'll be an interesting structure thing to see resolved. In terms of eligibility, for the 200 million in payments, the House is very broad, right? So it's acute, nonprofit acute hospitals, but it's also mental health hospitals, public health hospitals, right? Things like that, that as long as they're not state run, it includes, at least my read of it, again, it may not, all public health hospitals may be state hospitals, so I shouldn't say that, but certainly mental health hospitals, some entities affiliated with hospitals, right? So it's a larger population that has access to that $200 million number. In terms of high public pay, the House sets aside its own money for that, right? That $50 million, at least $50 million is going to them. No earmark on the Senate side. House certainly allows EOHHS to develop prioritization factors. There's nothing to say EOHHS can't do that. The Senate enumerates some of those prioritization factors. And then the Senate includes this provision about you got to let us know how you're doing it 45 days before you do it. The House doesn't include a similar provision. So now we're going to talk a little bit about unemployment insurance and premium pay in the Senate Ways and Means proposal. So unemployment insurance, not a whole lot different. In fact, really nothing different from the House proposal. So both the House and the Senate actually announced before any bill was released that they were going to do $500 million for UI. Keep in mind, we're going to borrow, we don't know exactly how much, but probably something in the order of $7 billion to be repaid by employer assessments. To make up for fund solvency, repay federal loans, and just kind of the catastrophic impact the pandemic has had on our UI system. So certainly $500 million is not nothing, but it's nowhere near $7 billion, right? And so that's why I think you see a lot of larger asks out there, and we've highlighted in our previous reports how impactful a larger number that is 1.5 billion, 2 billion, how much bigger an impact that'll have in savings to the state economy. There are 2 Senate amendments to increase the figure to $1 billion. I'd honestly be surprised if those got adopted, but we will see. The House did adopt an amendment to require the state to publicize the process by which UI claimants can have overpayments waived. There was an amendment, and there's actually legislation right now that would substantially expand the current overpayment waiver system. The state has a process that exists, and so the House said we need to advertise that process more. The state needs to advertise that process more. Similar amendment filed in the Senate. Wouldn't be surprised to see that get adopted, but again, we'll see. On premium pay, so the dollar figures here, House and Senate, are the same. We got $40 million that the governor also included for some state worker premium pay. And the House and Senate proposed $460 million for an ANF administered premium pay program. Like many of the things we talked about, the Senate approach has some more kind of details on how that works. So some notable differences between the 2 plans. Under the House proposal, eligibility includes but isn't limited to folks making 300% of FPL or less, so low income workers. My read of the Senate is eligibility is limited to people at 300% of FPL or less. Again, people who are lawyers who may read this differently, check that out, make sure I'm right. But my read of it is it's a little more targeted in its application to low-income workers. The Senate allows it to be provided as a premium, as a tax credit, as opposed to simply a bonus payment or something like that. My gut is that's not administratively how this is most efficiently done, right? In terms of kind of quality control, eligibility, all that stuff. The tax system is probably the system that's best handled to do that. I think the Senate approach seems to kind of acknowledge that could be a way we go. House has a minimum payment of $500 for eligible folks. The Senate does not. The Senate creates an advisory council to kind of come up with recommendations for ANF about how to structure it. They actually would include MTF on that, which is great. And so kind of understanding this is kind of a wonky thing, how you do this, who's eligible, who's not, how do you figure out how much they make, has this group to kind of advise that process. There's also a timeline difference. The House would require the payments to be made by the end of January, which is obviously a pretty tight timeline considering how novel this approach is. You don't see that in the Senate bill. So there are a number of premium pay amendments, as there were on the House side as well. On the Senate, because they've now got this advisory panel, you have some folks, recommending some different groups to be on it. An amendment we saw in the House also about kind of guaranteeing that MBTA workers who showed up during work are guaranteed a premium pay payment. There's an amendment to change that low income threshold from 300% of FPL to 500% of FPL, federal poverty level, and then kind of how you calculate payments for human service workers. So now we're going to talk about workforce and education in the Senate Ways and Means and the Senate debate proposal. So as I may have mentioned before, the way we kind of categorize each item can be a little, it's helpful in some ways. I think it can be misleading in other ways. And workforce is a great example of that. There's some items that are pretty specifically workforce focused, right? And those are the ones we've categorized as workforce. But as I mentioned, within, say, a healthcare item or an education item, you could have workforce programs as well. And so this chart gives a more holistic view of everything in the Senate, House, and governor's bills that touches on workforce, at least in my read of it. And what you see there is that governor was at 240 in a pretty, flexible resources for EOLWD. The Senate, when you all in, is probably a little north of $200 million. House not include, the House was at about 180.5 million or so. And what you see here too is some of the kind of different approach. House and Senate, I would say, governor and House, I would say, pretty broad, right? They set aside some money. There's a fair amount of discretion in terms of how it would be used. On the Senate side, Workforce Competitiveness Trust Fund is getting $75 million. So that's essentially akin to what the House and administration were proposing. And they say $25 million has to go to career technical institutes. This is this program about kind of when the school day ends, vocational classes for potential professionals and tradesmen in vocational schools, kind of reusing those classrooms, providing some technical training for folks who want to go into trades and things like that. So 25 million for that. And then the Senate has their two kind of unique workforce programs. So 50 million for a cybersecurity workforce program, $55 million for workforce and recruitment in a variety of human service fields. And then both the House and the Senate include this $30 million for community college workforce. They both have some nursing facility workforce recruitment and retention. And then again, mental health workforce, a big part of both the House and Senate Ways and Means proposals. On education, you know, thematically, I think you see some similarities between the House and Senate Ways and Means. You know, MBAE, I think, had a pretty smart proposal out there about using some FRF resources to kind of incentivize how local school districts are going to use either future SLA funds or use money they got from ARPA. You really haven't seen that yet in either the House or Senate Ways and Means proposals. Instead, you have these kind of relatively small earmarks for pretty targeted things, right? YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs. Senate does $100 million for vocational capital needs. House did a similar thing. There's some money for public higher ed endowment matching, which is a program that was reinstituted several years ago. Some money for community college workforce programs, but really that's about it. So nothing kind of directly related to future SLA investments, nothing about early childhood education, right? So I do think this is an area that deserves some probably increased focus going forward. So now we'll talk about tax provisions in the Senate proposal on ARPA and the surplus. So pretty similar really between the House and the Senate Ways and Means bill. Not a whole lot on the tax front. We got some cleanup on the child tax credit, which was recently expanded. Basically, I think that the way it was done probably didn't appropriately account for folks who are part-time state residents in terms of what their credit would be. So you see that cleanup in both the House and the Senate Ways and Means versions. And then you may recall earlier this year, there was legislation passed that said that for a variety of state and federal grants and loan programs, they would not be taxable in tax year 2020. This extends that to tax year 2021 and also includes some other state and federal programs that either hadn't been created when the initial provision was passed or just weren't included for whatever reason. So that's something that folks have been calling for a while. I will say that at least those that have been treated as not taxed at the federal level, there's no danger of us running afoul of that federal provision about tax changes, using FRF to pay for tax changes. They explicitly allow you to do that. And honestly, given the level of revenues this year, I don't think that would be a challenge anyways to meet the test on that, but just in case you were wondering. In terms of tax amendments on the Senate side, so there are several, right? So increase the historic tax credit, create a state version of a live theater tax incentive program at about $5 million. Senator Tarr proposes reinstituting the state's charitable tax deduction, which, as you know, has been delayed for the last couple of years. Proposes putting in place a 2-week sales tax holiday. And then there's an amendment from Senator Feeney to further enhance the state's child tax credit. So that's what we got. So now just some kind of general amendments themes and what's next. So first of all, kind of interesting, you know, this is a brave new world in terms of ARPA bills, right? And we saw over 1,100 amendments on the House side. While there's usually fewer amendments on the Senate than on the House, we saw significantly fewer on the Senate than the House, about 400 amendments fewer. I think that's probably a function of the fact that once folks saw the House process, how it played out, all that stuff, people kind of knew what was likely in play, what was likely not in play. And so I think the House process was probably helpful in culling Senate amendments a little bit, but 722 amendments is still a lot of amendments, okay? The total fiscal impact, we have that at 5.6 billion. As you'll see, the vast majority, so quick math, what is that? 72% of amendments are earmark amendments. The dollar figure on that is actually significantly less. There are a number of amendments. This is true on the House side as well. Big spending item amendments, right? $100 million program. So when you see that total fiscal impact over 5 billion, a lot of that reflects these kind of pretty broad and robust policy proposals, while a lot of the earmarks, while there are some pretty big earmarks, a lot of them continue to be in that probably $50,000 to $1 million range, right? There are some policy proposal amendments, not a ton, certainly less than you would see in a normal budget, but there are about 45 amendments proposing new policy sections. There are also a number of amendments amending existing policies. And in total, that the new policy amendments propose about 80 new policies. So in terms of themes, it's really, I stole a lot of this from my earlier House slide, I gotta be honest with you. hyper-local focus, right? A lot of infrastructure, economic development, tourism earmarks at the local level. You continue to see, kind of different from the normal budget process, a lot of big ticket items, right? So we have 77 amendments of $10 million or more. You wouldn't really see that in the budget probably. But it's really difficult to kind of identify some specific policy areas aside from that kind of local focus to see them go on the floor, right? It's not like you see 50 different childcare amendments with 25 co-sponsors or something related to changing the essential worker program or workforce. I don't see that going through. So that's not to say that there won't be some big policy programs or policy changes, but the amendments really appear to be pretty focused on local COVID recovery earmarks, right? So just to give you a sense of the amendments by our spending area, right? What you see here is other is a pretty big catch-all. A lot of amendments weren't filed to a line item, even though they clearly are supposed to go in a line item. So we just throw those in the other category. But you see, right? A lot of housing stuff, which is expensive. A lot of earmarks in the kind of infrastructure, workforce space, and then the tourism amendments are probably really showing up in that other category there as well. And what you see though is, again, you got a $3.7 billion bill. They're probably going to add $150 to $200 million on the floor. So not too many of those big ticket items are probably going to make it through as through amendment. So things to watch on the floor, as I just said, my guess is they'll probably spend something in the similar range as what the House did. It's one area of kind of potential confusion again is a lot of the earmarks are probably going to add new spending, right? And I think the Senate created an item to kind of reside for new earmarks to reside in. They may also earmark out of existing programs, right? So of that $400 million in mental health, it's possible they add a new $5 million earmark for a program without adding to that bottom line. So that's something to watch as you see a program go through. In terms of general policy areas of focus, disproportionately impacted communities, I'm sure you'll see a fair amount in there. You could see some stuff related to climate or environmental infrastructure, but again, nothing really jumps out as like, oh, I bet they'll move a lot in this area. So questions going forward. One is, how long will debate take, right? So obviously debate is expected to start on Wednesday. Thursday's Veterans Day. House took 2 days, 2 full days. Certainly possible the Senate gets it done in 1 day. If they don't, my guess would be it would be a Wednesday, Friday debate. And that, aside from just kind of general interest, I think the other question there is kind of, when does this bill get to conference committee or however it's going to get resolved, right? And so that's really how why that question I think is important. The total all-in spend, I think, is a huge question, right? You could easily imagine these two bills, even though they're both going to end up probably in the $3.8, $3.9 billion range. If you've got $500 million, $600 million in unique spending in both bills, all of a sudden you got yourself a $4.4, $4.3, $4.5 billion bill, and that may be more than folks want to spend. And so you absolutely could see, depending on how that all works together, spending reductions in conference committee because they want to, match up to the Gov's 4.2 number or something like that. In terms of policy differences, the ones that I see, and again, I'm sure at the line item level there are more that I have missed, but provider payments, obviously, while there's some similarities, there's some pretty specific differences in terms of those two programs. Premium pay, right? There are some differences there, and then line item language. There at a certain point is a philosophical approach about how much control you want over that money or how much discretion you want, and that's going to have to be resolved on a policy to policy basis. And then finally, when does this bill get to the governor's desk? As you probably know, session ends on November 17th, formal session for the year. I'm sure they want to get it to the governor's desk by then. They could absolutely get it to him after that date. So they will continue to be an informal session past then. So the bill doesn't die on November 17th. That doesn't mean they can't get it to him until after January. They could absolutely still get it to him between November 18th and December 31st. Somebody could object to it in informal session. You always hear about that. Realistically speaking, it's hard to imagine somebody holding this up for 6 weeks in informal session. And so I think it could happen post November 17th. That said, I think they're going to want to try as much as they can to get something for the end of formal session. But a lot of that's going to be dependent on when it gets to the governor's desk and all that kind of thing. So those are the big questions. That is this presentation. Thank you so much for this. I will just say in closing, for whoever's making it to the end, probably not very many people, please let us know what you thought of this. Please send along comments, questions. If it makes sense for us to do this again, definitely like having folks on this to take questions in real time. But if this is more convenient for folks, we'd absolutely consider doing this more in the future. So thanks so much. And hopefully I will see everyone soon.